private land? Barbara's silence was long enough to answer. The guy packed up, apologized, and drove off in his truck, leaving Barbara standing there with a bright orange wheel and nothing to measure but her own pride. That afternoon, I filed a formal complaint with the county, citing harassment and attempted unauthorized marking of private land. It wasn't a criminal case, but it was another log on the fire, another brick in the slow but steady wall I was building around my peace. I knew that legal tools weren't always fast, but they were permanent. They left records, paper trails. And people like Barbara eventually choke on their own paper trails. That night, I returned to the treehouse, sat on the top deck with a mug of strong coffee, and watched the water reflect the fading light like a mirror for everything that had happened. It was quiet again, but the silence felt earned now. Not fragile. Not temporary. I wasn't just defending a treehouse anymore. I was defending the right to draw a line, physically, legally, and emotionally, between what's mine and what people. It was a Sunday morning when she made her boldest move yet, the kind that doesn't even pretend to be subtle. I just finished checking the trail cams and was heading down to the dock with a cup of coffee when I noticed something unusual about the main community gate at the end of the gravel road. It was closed. Not just closed in the usual decorative, slightly open kind of way it always was, but latched shut with an actual steel padlock and a laminated sign zip-tied to the bars. I walked up to it, read the sign, and blinked in disbelief. It read, "Closed for private use, HOA President Authorization, Community Safety Audit in Progress." The date was backdated to 2 days earlier, and the signature line had Barbara Hutchins scrawled across it like she was some kind of local sheriff. Except this wasn't a crime scene or an emergency drill. It was a blockade. She had locked the only vehicle-accessible route to my property without notice, without a vote, and without a shred of legal standing. And judging from the paint markers on the gravel, she'd even had the landscaping team spray temporary lines around the culvert, as if they were preparing for roadwork that didn't exist. I stood there for a long moment, cars idling behind me as weekenders tried to figure out why the main access road was suddenly acting like the entrance to a military base. One guy honked. Another tried to call Barbara, only to get sent to voicemail. A third resident, Janice, leaned out her window and said, "Is this another one of her community improvements?" I said, "It's another one of her power trips." I walked back up the trail to my cabin, called Darnell, and explained the situation in measured, deliberate words. He didn't even ask for clarification. He just groaned and said, "You've got to be kidding me. She actually locked the road?" I said, "Padlock and everything. Like she owns the terrain." He sighed. "All right. I'll be there within the hour." When he arrived, Barbara was already at the gate, standing like a general reviewing her troops. She wore a sun hat the size of a satellite dish and carried a clipboard like it was a ceremonial scepter. Darnell didn't even wait for her speech. He walked right up to the gate, inspected the lock, and asked her one question. "Did the board vote on this?" Barbara paused. "In an emergency executive capacity, I exercise discretionary authority." Darnell blinked. "Emergency executive, what now?" She started launching into a prepared speech, citing clauses about roadway integrity, pedestrian safety, and her suspicion that the increase in treehouse visitors had compromised the ground structure around the culvert. Darnell held up a hand. "Stop. Just stop. There's no declaration of emergency. There's no road damage. And this padlock? This is tampering with access to private property. That's criminal, Barbara." She scoffed, tried to wave it off as preventative maintenance, and Darnell, visibly done with her antics, turned to me and asked if I had the footage of her placing the sign. I said yes. I did better. I had it printed, time-stamped, and handed it to him. Barbara's face was right there in grainy black and white, zip-tying her homemade decree like a monarch fencing off the royal forest. Darnell made a call. Within half an hour, a county works crew came out, cut the lock, and issued a notice of misuse to the HOA board. Barbara tried to argue, but this time nobody listened. In fact, a few neighbors had gathered near the trailhead, murmuring among themselves, some shook their heads. A few took pictures. And one man, Rick from Lot 9, snorted and muttered, "She's finally losing the plot." I didn't say anything. I just watched her watch us, and for the first time, I saw something crack behind her rehearsed smile. It wasn't defeat. Not quite. But it was doubt. And for someone like her, doubt is poison. Because doubt means people might stop listening. And if they stop listening, they stop obeying. But she wasn't done. Not even close. Because the next morning, I received an official notice in the mail. Not from a court. Not from the county. But from an obscure online auction platform I'd never heard of. The subject line read, "Upcoming listing approval, Treehouse Lodge, Vacation Experience category." My heart sank. I opened the email and found a listing page in draft mode. It had 3 pictures of my treehouse, taken from a drone, clearly barbarous, and a description that made my head spin. Experience the tranquility of Upper Silver Lake from this rustic yet refined treehouse hideaway. Now available for weekend stays as part of the Upper Silver Lake HOA Community Rental Initiative. All proceeds support community beautification efforts. There was no name listed. Just the HOA as the managing organization and a hyperlink to a terms of service page that, to no one's surprise, didn't actually exist. I printed it all out and marched over to Barbara's house. She was trimming her hedges, pretending to be just another lakeside citizen engaged in casual morning landscaping. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just held out the papers and said, "Is this your newest fantasy, or did you actually convince someone this is real?" She took one look at the listing, turned pale, and said, "It was just a draft. A proposal. Meant to gauge interest." I said, "You photographed my treehouse, posted it online without my consent, and put a price tag on it. That's not a proposal. That's theft by imagination." She started to say something about legal gray areas, but I held up a finger. No more gray areas. No more fake bylaws. No more flyers. You've crossed into full delusion now, and I'm done watching you spiral while pretending it's leadership. Then I turned and walked away. By nightfall, a copy of the auction listing was already posted on the HOA community board, with the word "cancelled" scrawled across it in permanent marker. Someone had added a sticky note underneath that read, "This ain't Airbnb, Barb." For the first time, people were laughing at her instead of nodding along. Even the usually quiet couple from Lot 3 sent out a mass email suggesting a vote of no confidence in the HOA presidency. But I wasn't celebrating yet. Because Barbara still had one thing left, a special town hall meeting she'd quietly scheduled for that Friday, under the pretense of revisiting community governance. I planned to attend, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. I wanted this on record. I wanted every word she said documented. And I wanted witnesses when her final card flopped onto the table and burned. That Friday, I walked into the community lodge where the meeting was being held, and for the first time in years, the place was full. Not with her usual supporters. With skeptics. With frustrated residents. With people who had put up with just enough of her antics to now be ready to see where the fire came from. Barbara stood at the podium, voice clear, posture straight, her hands gripping the sides like she was holding on to power itself. She launched into a speech about reclaiming shared vision, balancing private ownership with community needs, and proposing a reclassification of recreational structures for potential dual-use access. Someone asked if this was about the treehouse. She danced around it. Someone else asked if she'd used HOA funds for drone surveillance. She stammered. I didn't say a word. It had been quiet for 3 weeks. Not a fake meeting, not a drone, not a passive-aggressive flyer disguised as a community update. Just silence, the kind of peace I had nearly forgotten existed, the kind that reminded me why I had built the treehouse in the first place. The lake shimmered in the early morning light, the air smelled like pine and rain-washed dirt, and the birdsong was unbothered by Bluetooth speakers or HOA theatrics. I spent those days tending to the trail, replacing a few warped boards on the treehouse stairs, even patching up a spot on the roof where last month's wind had stripped a few shingles. But as calm as it was, I knew better than to trust it. Barbara Hutchins wasn't the type to surrender with grace. People like her never vanish quietly. They go down writing memos until their pen dries up. So when I received a brown envelope from the county records office stamped urgent, I knew it had to be the last card in her hand. Inside was a copy of a request to amend the founding HOA charter. At first, it didn't seem unusual: legal language, boring structure, typical HOA vocabulary. But halfway down the second page there it was. A proposed clause addendum titled Shared Use Reassignment Protocol for Non-Traditional Structures on Recreational Zones. And then, hidden in the middle of a paragraph so dry it could have been baked into sandpaper, a line that read, "In special cases where a structure is deemed to significantly influence communal ambience or neighborly engagement, said structure may be considered for partial usage integration upon board approval." It was a last-ditch effort, carefully worded, full of qualifiers and fake civility. But the goal was clear. She wanted the board to give her a legal wedge to pry open my property rights under the illusion of community benefit. I didn't get angry. I didn't even roll my eyes. I simply sat back in my chair, reread the clause, and smiled. Because what Barbara didn't know, or had forgotten in her crusade to control everything, was that I had never filed my original deed under a standard HOA contract. When my brother and I bought this land, we negotiated an exemption. We had documentation signed by the original developer, a legal carve-out for a few edge lots on the north bend of the lake, lots that were too remote and too self-sufficient to be folded easily into the main HOA jurisdiction. It was obscure. It was buried. But it was real. And I had the notarized letter to prove it. I spent the next day digging through boxes, folders, every old drawer in the cabin until I found it. The yellow envelope was still sealed in wax, dated 13 years earlier, with a signature from the developer and the county land officer. It stated that Lot 19, my lot, was exempt from future zoning interpretations unless agreed upon in writing by the owner. That was me. And I had never agreed. I scanned the document, saved it 3 ways, printed a fresh copy, and wrote one line on the back in black marker: "This is where it ends." Then I made one more phone call. Not to the county. Not to Darnell. But to someone Barbara had met only once, and clearly forgotten. Her name was Elise Ford, a corporate attorney who had moved into Lot 21 the year before and kept to herself. What no one knew, not even Barbara, was that Elise wasn't just a lawyer. She was the managing partner of a regional firm that handled disputes 3 times bigger and 10 times nastier than anything Barbara could dream up. And Elise owed me a favor. I had helped her fix her septic line during the last freeze, and in return, she'd once told me, "If you ever need to shut someone down for good, call me. I do it for a living." When I explained the situation, Elise didn't hesitate. She said, "Meet me at the next board meeting. Bring the original exemption. I'll bring the rest." So when that final meeting rolled around, the one Barbara had clearly hoped would be her redemption arc, I arrived early, sat quietly, and watched as she strutted into the lodge like a conquering general. She was wearing another signature blazer, holding a packet of proposed amendments, and flanked by 2 board members who looked slightly less enthusiastic than usual. The room filled slowly, but not like before. This time it wasn't just board residents or Barbara's inner circle. This time people came with notebooks, legal pads, and questions. They had seen too much. They were ready. Barbara opened the meeting with the same polished voice she always used, one that pretended to be democratic but always twisted toward domination. She began walking through the new clauses, her voice like syrup over sandpaper, building toward the one she really cared about. She got to it. "Read it out loud." Her tone swelled with that same old conviction. And then Elise stood up. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. She introduced herself, stated her profession, and handed the board a legal packet that included my exemption letter, 2 decades of case precedent on HOA over each, and a notarized declaration from the original developer confirming the boundary carve-out. Then she added one more line. "If this board attempts to vote this amendment into enforcement, despite this documented exemption, I will immediately pursue injunctive